What is imagination? Welcome to Philosopher's Corner. I'm John. What is imagination? We all have one. It's an integral part of every human being's experience. And we actually have very few answers for what it is exactly. So, the standard definition for imagination says that it's a human ability for the mind to conjure an image or a thought that is not real. And that's where we begin from. Now, we know that imagination, it is a sense, it is an ability within our mind to, in fact, create an image or an idea that doesn't exist. And that's where we begin. We know that's true. So we can't, or science hasn't identified the biological or physiological organ responsible for generating imagination. And they haven't created an experiment that really gives consistent results to try to figure out exactly which part of the brain or like which parts of the mechanisms are creating it. But we know that it exists, and we know that it's true, and we know that it's actually very powerful. So what is it? What is the imagination? Like a lot of people have tried to attempt to figure it out and nail it down. Personally, I think imagination is the analogy would be how a computer has a compiling language that goes between the language and the motherboard. I think imagination is that level between us as a human being as sort of biological hardware and our interface with the information of reality. And then it's a sort of go-between that does this interpretation of raw ideas, like pulling raw ideas and raw information out of the super consciousness of life that we live into and interprets it into a way, especially while we're conscious, of bringing in a vision or a new idea. It's a great way for integration of the unknown into the human experience for the individual. That being said, there are so many ways that imagination gets used. There's so many ways it can be affected. I think a lot of those have to do with the fact that human beings don't really take imagination seriously. And if we're assessing a human being and we have a person in front, right now we're going to use our imagination, right? Like imagination is typically ascribed to only creative endeavors, or people like kids having imaginary friends or hallucinating or whatever. But really, we use our imagination all the time, because when we simply say, hey, let's think about this, and we can bring up a mental image in our mind, that's due to imagination. Our imagination is one of the most powerful abilities that a human being has, and it's native to every human, and we all can do it, and we can just summon up an image in our mind of just about anything. Things that we're familiar with, or even things that we're not familiar with, even things that don't exist. The standard definition of being able to like come up with things in your mind, image in your mind, an idea that are not real, that's incorrect. I think the standard definition is incorrect, because we can also use our imagination. If I say, imagine the Eiffel Tower. Right now, 99.9% of you can see the Eiffel Tower in your mind. And there's nothing not real about that. Now, in terms of philosophical ontology, if you want to say, well, it's not real because we're not actually like physically by the Eiffel Tower. So in that way, it's not real, which is not what I think Merriam-Webster meant. But in that sense, it's like not real because it's in your mind. But it is a accurate rendition in your mind's eye of a real thing, which I think is important for people to know about imagination. Imagination is such a variable sense. It's like there's so many uses for imagination. It is one of the most powerful mind amplifiers that's built into our human system, that it's unbelievable that it gets relegated to childhood fancy and put into a bin of eccentrics and crazies or whatever. Because almost every great innovation in human history, the ideas, the thoughts, any of it, has first been introduced to a person through their imagination, or at least that person has been prepared for the acceptance of new information by their imagination at some point. And the imagination is an extremely powerful manifesting tool for creation and all sorts of other things. So in that case where I say imagine the Eiffel Tower, clearly you can imagine it, you see it very clearly, and now we're seeing it in this moment together in our mind's eye. Well, that's a very concrete thing. That's a very reliable sense. It's a very reliable human activity that we can engage in. And it's one, I mean, this is supposed to be philosophy. I'm not supposed to be like, I'm the pro imagination guy, but as it's a repeatable human universal sense, and it is an exceptionally powerful tool in the human experience. We can use our imagination to, like a computer, basically. It's even better than a computer, and we can use it to create renditions of images, of places, of things, of ideas. For sure, we can daydream, we can create things, we can create circumstances, ideas, literally anything that you want, you can do. The imagination is an incredible staging ground, and it doesn't have any of the limitations of physical resources. In my mind, I can imagine the rise and fall of the Roman Empire in like 5 seconds. I can do any of these philosophical thought exercises require the use of the imagination. In fact, philosophy itself spends a ton of time in the imagination because we're imagining things, and then at a certain point, the imagination has this sublimation into the hardcore parts of thinking that orthodox Western thought is more comfortable with saying, oh, well, that's real thinking, or that's like a real part. That's solid thought process when you go back into the right brain or the left brain or whatever and get into it more, Occidental thinking. But the imagination will lead you there, because if you're imagining something and then you can go back into more grounded thinking, I guess is the way to put it. But the imagination is what allows for a play space in the mind, a safe space to allow new thoughts, new ideas, new images, things we're unfamiliar with. And it doesn't matter how intelligent a human being is. When you're born and placed in a part of the world and you go around and you start being exposed to new information, you absolutely need some sort of buffer between you and the reality to find a way to put it together and process it in a palatable way. And then also, since the human being is also in a position to be a creator, that's a well documented fact that human beings can create events, they can create things, they can create realities, they can create mindsets. The imagination is an absolutely essential tool to allow for a human being to have the functionality to create things. And that's well documented. It doesn't matter if it's, a physicist coming up with a new idea. It doesn't matter if it's an artist coming up with a new movie. It doesn't matter if it's a legal person coming up with a new legal theory. Imagination is required. And the imagination is great because you can run through all these different iterations and permutations of thoughts. They can be exceptionally orthodox things. You can be a mathematician and you want to imagine a whole spread of, like, you're trying to figure out, I don't know, you're trying to figure out the unified equation or whatever. And in your mind, you can imagine all the iterations of the different equations, or you can imagine all the circumstances that you're trying to articulate in the unified field equation, right? You go, oh, well, I think about this, think about this, think about this. Well, in the standard sense, it's not real what you're imagining about that. Like, not real at all. It's just in your mind. But that doesn't make it any less valuable. In fact, in many ways, it makes it exceptionally more valuable. Because imagination really begins where the limit of our experience ends. So imagination is this sense, this critical cognitive tool that can take us past it can take us past our experiences. It can take us past our thought limitations. Well, it doesn't matter what your educational level is. You can bring in information and concepts and ideas and images that are way beyond your educational level because of imagination. And it can bring it to you in a way that's palatable to you, so you're not intimidated, or even if you are, it's a way that you can handle it, which in turn can make you go back and get educated or like look into specific subjects, but it's not even necessary because the imagination itself provides you that workaround. The imagination is really the key to being able to engage in the world in a fuller way, because we know this is a vibratory world, and for sure we have the 5 basic vibratory senses we all agree on, but we certainly have these other senses that are necessary in order to interpret all these other vibrations and informations that are coming into the world that they don't fit neatly into the 5 senses. And imagination is in this interesting spot where everybody admits that it's real. Nobody can say where it comes from, and nobody can really say which information it's collating. But we know that it's real, we know that it's repeatable, and then we know that it's useful and it has great utility. Because all great accomplishments, I mean, pretty much all great accomplishments have some form of imagination built into them. Now, when we break imagination down even more and we say, okay, well, what are some of these other things too? It's like, well, I think because we haven't taken imagination seriously enough as a common sense, that, or a universal sense might be a better way to say it, a universal human sense, is that some people, there's ways it can go. Imagination, since we don't have great schools and we don't have great training to show people how to use it, yeah, some people, the imagination can, like any other sense, can be used and be warped. Somebody can imagine bad stuff, or they can imagine unethical or immoral stuff, or they can imagine stuff that's delusional. They can have normal stresses. A person who's living a very stressful life and they're not working with all the right information and they don't have a lot of good counsel, they can activate their imagination and engage in delusion. And the delusion is their imagination trying to fit a context, in their life that's not commensurate with reality, and they're using their imagination to imagine that it's true, right? And that's obviously not great. So imagination can create good and bad situations for the individual. I think as they become aware and they bring it into the consciousness, then they can learn how to use it and not be delusional. Like, the flip side of that is an actor's entire job is to use their imagination to engage in pretend, which is, it's a conscious delusion. So that's where, if you're unconscious about it, it's a delusion that's unhelpful most of the time. And when a person becomes conscious of it and they can use it, even though it has the same mechanisms as a delusion, then it becomes positive, then it can become acting. But the imagination is key to both, right? Like in the case of an actor, the imagination is used to imagine the world, imagine the circumstances, imagine the sense of self, of a self whom they are not, but a self whom they are agreeing to pretend to portray and be. So imagination has many and varied uses. And depending on the level of consciousness about it, depends on the level of utility and the amount of harmony it has in a person's life as to whether it's being used in a healthy way or an unhealthy way. It's tremendously powerful. It's, and this is purely speculative, but philosophically, I would say imagination is one of the key areas of the mind that's going to allow for enhanced psychic abilities, most especially telepathy, which there's a great history of recorded, repeatable telepathy to various degrees. But imagination seems to be one of those areas that's required in order to open up those abilities. Because imagination is one of those perspective abilities that allows a person to imagine themselves more evolved, better, more skilled, and in a better state of being than they are. Like that's a function of imagination. To be able to imagine that you're better, to imagine you're more evolved, in a better state of being. And in that sense, imagination is one of the keys to evolution. As we sit down and we imagine ourselves being better, as we imagine that there are better circumstances. And the interesting thing is that a lot of times the imagination that services these aims, even though the person doesn't know that those things, is even unaware that any of those things could exist, and they just imagine it because it feels good or whatever leads them to it, and then it turns out that those things in fact are real. Like for instance, in the movie Jurassic Park, they made up the dinosaurs velociraptors. They weren't known to exist at the time of the movie. And then after they imagined them and put them in the movie, later on, they discovered velociraptors. So sometimes the imagination isn't even a flight of fancy or whimsy or an internal virtual reality projector simulator. It's actually a way of telling us what actually exists in the reality that we're just unaware of and don't have access to. So imagination. What is imagination? It's the part of our human faculty that allows us to receive images or ideas. Well, thanks for spending some time here at Philosopher's Corner. I hope you found this useful, and I hope you have a good day.